Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, the aggressive and hostile actions of the Chinese Communist Party pose a massive threat to the global order. The Chinese Communist Party's strategy can be summed up in 4 R's: resist, reduce, replace, and reorder. China resists American economic influence by manipulating American businesses and industries and stealing intellectual property. It reduces internal dissent and free expression of ideas through surveillance and censorship of its own people. It's essentially a police state, and it seeks to assert its power and influence in the United States by various means. The Chinese Communist Party intends to replace America as the world's technology leader through its Made in China 2025 initiative, which seeks to achieve Chinese dominance in high-tech manufacturing. And of course, it hopes to reorder international norms and institutions around itself. The CCP's mantra can best be described as win at all costs. And make no mistake, its reckless actions paint an alarming picture for the United States and our allies. For everything from national security to economic policy, there's a clear and urgent need to reorient our way of thinking on how we should respond to this threat from China. Despite the partisanship that has sometimes gripped this chamber for more than a year now, this is one area where, thankfully, there is broad bipartisan agreement. Our colleagues on both sides of the aisle recognize the growing threats posed by the CCP and the need to act. So last summer, the Senate took a major step forward by passing the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. This bipartisan bill was the result of intense bipartisan negotiations with our friend Senator Young from Indiana, leading negotiations on our side of the aisle. This legislation addresses a range of issues to help the United States reduce its reliance on China and to counter looming threats from the Communist Party. Without question, the cornerstone of USICA, as it's called, is funding for programs created by the CHIPS Act, which I introduced with the senator from Virginia, Senator Warner, in 2020, and nearly every senator in this body has supported. Semiconductor chips, which we've all had to learn a lot more about, are everywhere, from cell phones to cars to agricultural equipment to missile defense systems. Despite our need for a strong supply of these semiconductor chips, we overwhelmingly rely on other countries, most of them in Asia, to produce them. Taiwan alone produces about 63% of the advanced semiconductors in the world. If for some reason our supply of these semiconductors was cut off as a result of a natural disaster or another pandemic or military conflict, it would lead to very serious consequences for both our national security as well as our economy. When we talk about the need to address threats to our supply chain and threats coming from the People's Republic of China, semiconductors are front and center. Now, USICA provided the CHIPS program with $52 billion to bolster domestic semiconductor manufacturing and to secure this vulnerable supply chain. This legislation passed the Senate last summer by a vote of 68 to 32, which is an incredible bipartisan accomplishment these days. Unfortunately, the House of Representatives refused to act on this bipartisan bill. They said they wanted to pass their own version, which they have every right to do, of course, but they also should have been working at it diligently and acted quickly. The Chinese Communist Party simply isn't sitting around waiting on House Democrats to get their act together. So it took 8 months before the House of Representatives passed a bill aimed at competition with China, but unfortunately they chose to go the easy way, which is to pass strictly a partisan bill, which virtually no Republicans supported. Instead of mirroring the bipartisan process here in the Senate, Democrats only negotiated among themselves and excluded Republicans from that process. Democratic committee chairmen refused to consult with their Republican ranking members, and they ran off with the pen and crafted a partisan and unserious bill. Sure, this legislation does include a few bipartisan measures like CHIPS funding, as well as a proposal I led with Senator Casey, the senator from Pennsylvania, to review limited outbound investments in China. But House Democrats don't deserve a lot of credit for including a few bipartisan bills that they already support. They kept some of the overwhelmingly partisan pieces of USICA and tacked on a laundry list of unrelated and controversial provisions. The House-passed bill sends a whopping $8 billion to a UN climate slush fund, which has provided more than $100 million to China alone. So if the purpose of this effort is to counter threats from China, it doesn't exactly accomplish that goal when we end up sending money to China. Democrats also added provisions in the House related to immigration, from creating new types of visas to removing green card caps. Now, immigration is a serious and important issue, but these can't expect to see the light of day being haphazardly tacked onto this legislation. They need to be debated and marked up by the appropriate legislative committees and negotiated. Well, in true fashion, House Democrats added a range of handouts to their political supporters, especially labor unions, from massive slush funds to burdensome new labor requirements. Unions would win big with the House bill. The labor bosses apparently were promised some pretty big benefits in the Democrats' reckless tax and spending spree bill. Since that bill is now dead and buried, it looks like this was their way to try to appease their political supporters. As we've learned over the last year, our colleagues in the House can't seem to resist any opportunity to sneak in ridiculous partisan pet projects. Their bill would also establish a coral reef task force. You heard me correctly, a coral reef task force, and put $6 million toward a National Coral Reef Management Fellowship. Believe it or not, the term coral reef is mentioned more than 300 times in the House bill. No wonder it took them so long to put the bill together. Of course, it's not just what's in this bill that's a problem, it's what was left out. The bill's trade title, which was one of the most important parts of what the Senate did, championed by the senator from Idaho, the ranking member of the Finance Committee, Senator Crapo. But the House trade bill is entirely inadequate. It extends and expands trade adjustment assistance, which is normally something we do when we approve of a trade deal like the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. But they left out the most important part, which was trade promotion authority. We know trade promotion authority is absolutely critical to brokering strong trade agreements without extraordinary delays. And what the House did by including trade adjustment assistance without trade promotion authority does nothing to advance our goals to open up markets to American-made goods and services as agriculture. Well, the House bill also fails to push for a digital trade agreement and identify countries like the People's Republic of China that use censorship as a way to limit access to our tech industry. And it doesn't narrow relief from tariffs for businesses experiencing severe economic harm that has broad bipartisan support. So it's no surprise that the House bill was passed almost entirely along party lines. Unlike the bipartisan legislation here in the Senate, the House bill is an unserious attempt to help America compete with China. It just simply doesn't cut the mustard. House Democrats wasted about 8 months while they waited and waited and waited before even acting in this totally inadequate manner. And there's no chance, of course, the Senate will pass anything that resembles the House bill. But we do need legislation to confront growing threats from China, but we need to do it correctly. So that means what we need is a formal conference committee between the House and the Senate, and to ensure ultimately that the final product looks a whole lot like the Senate bill, which passed, as I said, with strong bipartisan support. This is really nothing to be toyed with. This is a matter of national and economic security, and something far too important for partisan jockeying, such as demonstrated by the House of Representatives in their totally inadequate and unserious piece of legislation. Madam President, I yield the floor.